Yes, it's still fighting in Bakhmut. It is making very painfully slow progress, but at huge cost. Russia has lost 2/3 of its main battle tanks, over 2,000 main battle tanks, and now has to prepare for a spring offensive from Ukraine. And it doesn't really know, I mean, none of us know where that's going to occur. So I think there's a really interesting challenge now as we switch from a Russian offensive into the potential for the Ukrainians to get on the front foot again.
Hello and welcome to Frontline from Times Radio. I'm Anna Cunningham. Joining us is retired Air Vice-Marshal Sean Bell, a military expert himself. He has flown Harrier fighter jets. He's served in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, the Gulf, as well as doing 3 tours of Afghanistan, and he has worked for the Ministry of Defence. Very good to have you with us, Sean.
Good afternoon, Anna.
Can we start with what your take is then on the latest on the ground in Ukraine? We are, of course, in April now. The weather is beginning to warm up after difficult conditions during the winter months. Is there any sign of that spring offensive, that much talked about spring offensive?
Well, in a way, to start where we are now is we really have to go back just over a year, because in fact, if we go back to 2014, President Putin decided to take Crimea and managed to walk in with almost without a gunshot being fired. And he has since sort of walked the streets of Crimea, Sevastopol, and been celebrated. So in some respects, many military analysts believe that Russia fully expected to just be able to walk into Ukraine and be welcomed with rose petals on the streets of Kyiv. But of course, that didn't happen. Russians tried to take Kyiv by force. Remember the 40-mile convoys. Then they tried to, consolidate somewhat their ambitions. And then the sort of third attempt has really been a grinding war of attrition, largely focused around the Donbass now, always defined as Putin's special military operation rather than a war. And it's quite difficult to understand exactly what he's hoping to achieve from this. But what was clear is after, many decades, many centuries of fighting in the region, in the winter, the weather isn't conducive to maneuver warfare because it's fairly flat terrain. It gets very boggy in the winter. It hardens up for a time, then gets soft again. And it's only when the spring, sort of May, June time, when it hardens up. So after a really brutal first year of this campaign, Russia sort of got bogged down. It was pretty clear that Putin had said, right, get the Donbass for me, to his military commanders. And by the way, it looks like Ukraine's going to mount a spring offensive, so you better do your offensive before that. So immediately after Christmas in January, we saw a big upsurge. Russia had taken 300,000 new recruits. It had done its mobilized a huge segment of Russian society, thrown them into the battle fairly poorly trained. And of course, it was winter. They couldn't do off-road maneuvering particularly well. And frankly, by any metric, their Russian spring offensive before spring has been an abject failure. It's cost loads of lives, just in Bakhmut alone, 30,000 lives, and has really sort of ground a bit to a halt. Now, through all that time, Ukraine had to mount some sort of defence. Generally speaking, you lose 1/3 of the number of people on defence you do on attack, but preparing all the time for their own spring offensive. So I think where we are today, I know it's a long roundabout way of getting to your question, I apologise for that, but in a way, Russia has sort of run out of ideas at the moment. Yes, it's still fighting in Bakhmut. It is making very painfully slow progress, but at huge cost. Russia has lost 2/3 of its main battle tanks, over 2,000 main battle tanks, and now has to prepare for a spring offensive from Ukraine. And it doesn't really know, I mean, none of us know where that's going to occur. So I think there's a a really interesting challenge now as we switch from a Russian offensive into the potential for the Ukrainians to get on the front foot again. And that's what we're expecting to see over the coming days and weeks.
It's a great explanation that you have given us. Let's just hone in, if you would, a bit on that idea of Ukraine preparing for its own offensive. We know that it has been equipping itself, preparing its forces. We know that Ukrainian troops that have been training on those Challenger 2 tanks in the UK have now returned to Ukraine. We know that 14 of those tanks are being sent. But what concerns are there about the details of any potential Ukrainian maneuvers that may have fallen into Russian hands? And when I say this, I'm talking about those leaks out of the US, the Pentagon leaks. We know that there was an FBI raid and arrest on a US Air National Guard last week, the allegations being that he leaked highly sensitive documents online, and those then fell into the hands of Russian Telegram channels. Do you think that this may have led Russia to an intelligence advantage?
The short answer is no. And part of the reason for that is the there's a number of ways of looking at this. One of the things is intelligence is normally incredibly time sensitive. So when and where will Ukraine mount the spring offensive is probably well above top secret. But the moment they launch that offensive, it's no longer secret. It's just unclassified because everybody knows about it. So, and some of the documents that were leaked go back to December last year, and a lot of the information in there is completely out of date. One of the bits of information, for example, was talking about Ukraine running short of air defense missiles for Kyiv, and that if they didn't get resupplied, then later in the spring, they would run out. Now, at face value, that looks very worrying. But in reality, if you want to get more missiles provided by the international community, you have to make an impact statement to the international community about what will happen if you don't get those missiles. And my understanding is that very quickly, having briefed the international community there was a shortcoming, that those missiles were then made available to make sure that Kyiv did not run out. So I do think whilst it's of concern, of course it's of concern, all of the information I saw, apart from the piece about special forces, and we can come on to that if you like, but nearly everything else you looked at and thought, this is a means to an end. It doesn't tell me anything new that I didn't really know from my various briefings or from experience before. And certainly nothing that would give an advantage to Russia. And let's be quite clear, even if it did, Russia would be deeply skeptical that we hadn't literally given them a bit of information to try and dupe them into thinking one thing when in fact quite the opposite was going to occur. So I think it's less about the security breach and more about America will be somewhat embarrassed that somehow this information has got out. And often as not, it's not the information itself, it's how you got that information. How many battle tanks are serviceable on the battlefields isn't particularly sensitive. But if you've got a spy in a Russian camp somewhere that's telling you that information, that is the risk when these sorts of things get leaked. So it's less about compromising operations and more about compromising the way that information has been secured.
You mentioned the leaks about special forces. Did that surprise you?
Well, the British government never comments on where special forces are or are not. When I was with the military, both on operational duties and with the Harrier Force, we regularly operated with the special forces. And I am just very glad we have them on our side, to be frank. They are a national treasure. They go to dark, dangerous places in the world to look after our national interests. Now, whether or not, I genuinely have no idea whether they're in Ukraine or not. I wouldn't want to know. I have security clearances, but it's the sort of thing that I wouldn't want to know, even if it was made available. But I think the fact that there was a leak suggesting they were there, again, it's timely. Most of my experience of special forces is they don't sit and camp out in a foreign country. They go in there to do a specific job and then get extracted quickly again. They're far too valuable to just leave them there. So if the special forces had been in Ukraine, I think they certainly wouldn't be remaining there for long periods of time, because that would absolutely compromise their own security. So am I surprised that special forces from other countries and our own are involved generically around this? No, I'm not. I would be quite surprised if we had a lingering presence of any special forces in Ukraine, because that would be very difficult. Let's be blunt, Ukraine is not in NATO. NATO cannot get directly involved, and nationally, both the West generically, but the US and the UK are not yet at the position where we would want to put our own troops on the ground and thus directly engage with this war. So it's quite important to remember that however much we might support Ukraine, it's slightly different than actually picking up arms and actually doing the fighting on their behalf.
Yeah, it's very important to make that clear, that although there is this speculation, this leak, that there could have been special forces there, that, as you said, Ukraine is not in NATO, British troops are not on the ground. I just want to go back to the situation in the east of Ukraine, and specifically Bakhmut, because it has been a big focus of very intense fighting in recent months. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky himself has warned of an open road to the east of Ukraine should Russia take Bakhmut, but he has equally declined to withdraw Ukrainian forces from that area. We have seen recently two Russian former convicts who claimed that they served as commanders with the Wagner Group, admitting, seemingly in a video, confessing that they had committed war crimes. Now, this video was taken by a Russian human rights group, and the report is that they confessed to these crimes in Bakhmut and Soledar, including the killing of children. I don't know if you've seen this video. It's a very difficult watch, and there are questions about whether these two people are drunk. I mean, you see them, it seems to be sort of, swaying, and they're smoking. But one of them talks about a kill shot on a child aged 5 or 6. What do you make of this?
Well, there's a lot in that question. First of all, no, I have not seen the video, but having served 2 years of my life, 3 tours in Afghanistan, I take no delight in seeing some of the atrocities that get committed in war. And despite being to the funeral of many of my colleagues, the thing that always upset me on the battlefield and certainly around Kabul was children, when they get hurt. I think that as any parent, it just hurts in a way that, normal deaths, whilst abhorrent, don't. One of the challenges, but to step away from the personal bit of it, one of the challenges in Bakhmut is that Putin has been evidently telling his commanders to take Bakhmut as a stepping stone to taking the Donbass. Even though Bakhmut, from a military perspective, has no great tactical significance. And urban fighting, in other words, trying to fight from street to street, is incredibly difficult to do, incredibly dangerous to do, because every corner, every window, every door is a trap. And even for well-trained troops with very good support, very good tactics, you normally lose 3 soldiers to every one of the defenders that gets killed. As it turns out, because Russia doesn't have well-trained soldiers, doesn't have experienced soldiers, and has literally been throwing people to the fight, most Western analysts believe Russians are losing 7 times as many soldiers as the Ukrainians are. Now, as a result, the Russian army, frankly, struggled to make any progress in Bakhmut and stalled. So the Wagner group of mercenaries was under Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's himself a convicted thief, was given license, basically paid a lot of money to get his convicts, his soldiers, which are now convicts, into the main battle. And he was given approval to go and recruit these convicts from prisons. They have absolutely minimal training. You can imagine that they're not trustworthy, so they are given a very short leash. They're not trained in the law of armed conflict. They're not trained in the Geneva Convention. They're not trained in the ways of war. And therefore, it shouldn't be any great surprise that they are committing atrocities along the way, whether it's with killing children, beheading people. And all of these war crimes are directly linked to President Putin. He's the one who's commissioned this to happen. He's the one who's commissioned. And one of the reasons he's doing it is because he judged that Russian society was starting to get a bit upset about the number of soldiers heading back home, in body bags, frankly. And he probably judged that convicts would worry Russian society less. It's still a life, but that's probably his judgment. As a result, the Wagner Group, by all accounts, the Russians and the Wagner Group have lost over 30,000 soldiers in Bakhmut alone. And in a way, when you are faced with horrific death every day, the soldiers just become inured to it. They will drink heavily. Russia's always had a culture of drinking heavily with spirits, whether in battle or not. And probably they're not just suffering from PTSD, they're probably expecting to die the next day. I'm not making excuses for them, but it just shows when you have untrained mercenaries who are not there for Queen and Country, not there for King and Country, they're there purely for the money, stepping over the bodies of their comrades just to try to take an extra few shillings home in the evening. It's horrendous. And the whole battle of Bakhmut, there'll be films about that battle in the years to come. And what's interesting as well is that the West tried to advise President Zelensky to pull his soldiers out because there was a risk of them getting enveloped. And he had some pretty seasoned war fighters in there. But President Zelensky did quite the opposite. He actually reinforced the city. And most West analysts were going, oh no, he's got himself dragged into this war of egos between himself and Putin, a war of attrition, the David versus Goliath, and hoping that David can prevail. Whereas in fact, in a war of attrition, the largest number normally prevails. But actually what President Zelensky has very effectively done is just ground down the Russian soldiers. The argument was, we're going to have to fight Russia somewhere. If they're going to keep throwing themselves at us, we're going to have to kill them. And if they're going to throw themselves in such ridiculous numbers in the city like Bakhmut and sacrifice 7 of them for every one of ours, then we're going to stay here as long as possible, do the most possible damage to the Russians, which will give us the best possible chance in springtime. And if we don't fight them in Bakhmut, we're going to fight them somewhere else. So why don't we fight them here? I mean, it's all brutal. It's horrendous. It's the horrors of war, but it's being played out in Bakhmut as we speak.
And I think what's interesting about that is because of the situation in Bakhmut, we're not actually seeing much video come out of there. It's a very difficult place for journalists to get to and to report from. I know some journalists who have been in the past month to the front lines, and previously where they could get in and out fairly easily is now a lot more restricted on that single road into Bakhmut that there is. But what they have described when they have got out is that trench warfare, that almost World War One style trenches, the way it's being fought. I mean, is this a situation which you think is just going to continue like that? Or do you find any confidence in the tactics of President Volodymyr Zelensky that could change that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting you brought it up, because one of the key factors here is that Russia is fighting using 20th century warfare. It's literally just throwing bodies at machine guns until the machine gun overheats and then somebody gets through. Because traditionally, most of Russian wars, they've had more soldiers and therefore they've just thrown them at the enemy. The thing that one of the it'd be unfair to say the only reason, but one of the main reasons why Ukraine hasn't fallen, apart from the sheer tenacity and bravery of their soldiers, is the fact that the West has been providing precision weapons. At the end of the First World War, the West saw the atrocities, the millions of lives that have been lost without really moving the battlefield, the line of contact at all. And they decided to find a different form of warfare, and therefore they use maneuver warfare. They use weapons that strike deep behind the enemy lines, that are precision strike. And that costs a lot of money. I mean, a guided weapon costs something like 20 times as much as an unguided weapon. But you need significantly fewer of them. And I think one of the great examples of that from my own history is if you look at the Second World War, the Bomber Command, when they were flying missions over Germany, the Lancaster used to carry 20 bombs. There would be 1,000 bomber raids, and still they wouldn't hit their target because the average miss distance of a bomb then was 4 miles. So even though they chucked 20,000 bombs around, they still didn't hit their target, but caused devastation. A modern fast jet, a Typhoon, will have 3 bombs on board. Each of those bombs can hit their target within 4 feet. And therefore, you don't need lots of bombers. So in the same way that Russia is used to just firing artillery across the battlefield, literally causing carnage and devastation everywhere, hitting schools, hitting anything that's in its way, what the West has provided is there's those same artillery pieces, but with radar guidance. So now you can track where the shell has been launched from. That gives you a grid coordinate. Now you can load that into a kit and you can fire a round straight back at the barrel of the gun that's just been firing at you. That is incredibly more effective than just bludgeoning away. And I think that's where you saw the example, I think, only a few months ago, where a collection point for Russian soldiers, several of them had their mobile phones on. All of those are easily tracked. It created a very juicy target, and Ukraine was able to strike it. However horrendous it is, from a war's unfortunately about killing more of their people than yours die, and the use of technology which the West has provisioned has made a huge difference to the role of the war. But it has to be used in a certain way, and that's why the training that's going on is so important, particularly around these main battle tanks, which is the sort of the pinnacle, I think, of Western technology that's being made available.
We have a lot to get through, and we appreciate your expertise. In a nutshell, though, do you think at this stage in the war in Ukraine that Ukraine could retake Crimea and the Donbass?
No. Most military analysts believe that, let's take Crimea, that when the Nazis tried to take Ukraine, they flooded into Ukraine but never managed to take Crimea. It is a jewel in the crown for Russia. It's not because of Crimea, but because of Sevastopol. Russia is one of the biggest countries in the world, but it didn't have a warm water port. Sevastopol, taken by Peter the Great hundreds of years ago, is that warm water port, and Russia is not going to give that up lightly. And most military analysts would argue that it was always part of Russia. It was given, in inverted commas, to Ukraine by Khrushchev in 1954, I think, when Ukraine was a county of Russia. So it's nothing more than administratively a gift. And then, of course, when the Cold War ended in 1991, that Russia and Ukraine almost went to war about Crimea, because they went, it's not. So it would be very difficult for militarily to take Crimea, and also Russia would fight to the end to hold it. So for most military analysts, the US included, do not think it's remotely feasible that Ukraine will take that back. The Donbass is slightly different, but again, it's shark-infested custard, the Donbass. The further east you go in it, the closer you are to the Russian border, the more they are actually Russians there. And even if Ukraine was to take it back, there is a question that it will be just a hornet's nest of problems for Ukraine. But given we don't have the time, we haven't got a bottle of wine in the middle of the table to talk this through. The fact is that most analysts believe that this is a war that Ukraine cannot win, but also a war that Russia can't lose. I should explain that. Ukraine will never be able to get Russian soldiers out of their land completely, and Russia can't lose because it will never give up Crimea, and it will be virtually impossible for Ukraine to kick Russia completely out of the Donbass. So the real question then becomes, so what's all this fighting for? It's about where that boundary ends up. And, common question is, well, who's going to win? There are no winners in this war. Let's be absolutely clear. Hundreds of thousands of lives will be lost. Communities devastated, families, relocated. I mean, there are no winners. But eventually, both sides will get exhausted, and some new line will be drawn on a map. And I think that'll be where it becomes really interesting, because President Zelensky publicly would never compromise, but privately, he can only continue with the support of the West, both financial and weapons. And the West, particularly Joe Biden, will be very reluctant for America to be seen to be perpetuating a war that Ukraine can't win, and simply ends up losing thousands more lives. So I think we will eventually get to the stage behind closed doors where some very difficult conversations will be had, with China probably exerting a bit of pressure on Russia, and America exerting quite a lot of pressure on Ukraine to try and draw this to a close in whatever form that sort of peace looks like.
It's interesting you added the word in there, eventually. I mean, for anybody who thinks that, this war will come to a close rapidly, and clearly, at the very beginning, President Putin thought it would end very rapidly. That is not the case. Just to take a wider look at the situation with Russia, I'm interested to get your take on the latest reports about covert Russian ships preparing sabotage of Britain in the North Sea. Now, this has come from journalists and Scandinavian intelligence agencies, reporting that Russian ships are turning off transponders and conducting surveillance against infrastructure and military targets in the North Sea. If this is the case, how concerned should we be?
Well, unfortunately, I know we're on radio, but for viewers that can see me, I've got a lot of grey hair, and that's partly because I've spent most of my formative years in the military during the Cold War. And throughout the Cold War, the Russians were doing exactly this. This is nothing new at all. They have constantly had military ships that are covertly called scientific research vessels or something, some euphemism like that. If they were genuinely scientific research vessels, they wouldn't be turning off their transponders. They would be following the laws of the sea and whatever. But those ships go around intelligence gathering. They go around watching. They go loiter near our submarine bases. They loiter when we're doing flying exercises. They loiter when there are the carriers, the aircraft carriers leave port and watch what we're doing. They're listening, they're watching, they're learning, they're tracking. So that is happening all the time. That shouldn't be a surprise. I think from a military perspective, it's worth reassuring listeners that probably the most strategically dangerous targets that they could have are probably the communication links across the North Atlantic, which of course are incredibly deep, but we are heavily dependent on those sorts of links. But I would not, you can bunch all these things into the same sort of caveat as what happens if somebody exploded a bomb in space and took out all the satellites. Our communications, our banking system, our televisions, everything is linked to satellites. There are a lot of different ways these days in which you can cause mischief on a global scale. And it is no surprise that Russia, China, India, US, and ourselves are constantly exploring ways that we can disrupt the intelligence of our potential enemies. So, yes, whilst it's interesting to read, I have to say that these ships have been doing this for a long, long time. It's just we've not been reporting on them.
Just to go back to those Pentagon leaks, something that you mentioned there about the frequency that Russian jets may buzz British jets, the RAF jets. There was one report in those leaks about an incident on September the 29th between a Russian warplane and an RAF jet, with reportedly the Russian jet attempting to release a missile. It didn't launch. How close a miss was this?
The answer is we don't really know, because we are in an information war, and without getting into high levels of secrecy, it's quite difficult to know when a missile has misfired. You know it when you're the aircraft pilot, because you've pressed the trigger and the thing hasn't whooshed off the rails. But for anybody outside, it's a lot more difficult to tell. But as you say, the RC-135 rivet joint is one of our sort of intelligence gathering aircraft, 30 people on board, not armed. It was an Su-27 flanker that was flying. The aircraft, there was no question it was not in controlled airspace. It was in completely international airspace. There was no reason for the Russians to shoot it down. But let's be clear, the airspace around Ukraine, the international airspace around Ukraine, where anybody can fly, is absolutely bristling with NATO aircraft. Two main reasons, one of which is to make sure that Russia knows that if it tries to spread its wings further than Ukraine, it won't be taking on a David, it'll be taking on a super Goliath, and making sure that it recognizes the folly of even thinking about doing that. But the second thing is that not only is the West able to help Ukraine with weapons, but these NATO aircraft are the eyes and the ears. They're looking out over the battlefield. They're listening, they're watching, they're learning. And there's no doubt that Russia will be very, very upset and angry that these aircraft can potentially be helping Ukraine, but doing it from international airspace. And therefore, having military aircraft just inside international airspace, completely legitimately able to be there, will undoubtedly be escalating frictions. And as soon as you've got that, when you've got a Russian aircraft with pilots that don't get anything like the training that we have in the West, they don't have anything like the simulation training that we have in the West, they don't do big exercises like Red Flag. Having flown in these exercises, it's brutal, the sort of training we go through, but it is the best in the world. Russia has nothing like that. So having poor radios, not hearing properly, the risk of them firing something and escalating. Because I do understand that after that event, the Russians were very keen to apologize through back channels. They said, look, that was our mistake. Sorry about that. Because it's actually not in Russia's interest to escalate. I think the MQ-9 incident, remember the drone incident just back in March, where the same Russian fighter, the Su-27 flanker, was dropping fuel all over this unmanned drone, and was clearly trying to cause the engine to blow or whatever by dumping fuel on it, but actually ended up clipping it with his aircraft. And there was lots of talk about the Russians deliberately hitting it. As a former fighter pilot, you would never hit another airplane with your aircraft, because you probably wouldn't get away with it. The risk of doing damage to your aircraft. I had the misfortune of having to eject out of a Harrier many years ago, 30 years ago. It's not a pleasant experience. And the banter you get for not bringing your aircraft back at the end of the day is pretty significant. So this was Russian incompetence of hitting that aircraft with his own aircraft. But it just shows the dangers of escalation, of miscalculation, when you have both sides both recognizing they're involved in a war, but actually not against each other. But the risk of miscalculation, I think, is pretty evident. And it won't be the last time we see this sort of friction, I suspect, until Russia decides to lay down its arms and pause or stop.
You've put that into context for us. So not tactics, but miscalculation. You mentioned just before about misinformation. Let's just round up our discussion with one particular focus, because whenever we are discussing war, there is always that question about misinformation, propaganda on either side, all sides, any side. But very interesting to see the video released from the Kremlin of President Vladimir Putin visiting certain areas of Ukraine, and the question being, the images were said to be in Kherson and Luhansk, the regions in occupied Ukraine. Some in the media, though, very perplexed and questioning, is it really Vladimir Putin? Because he has taken so many precautions over COVID previously. You see him on that very long table. I think it was when President Emmanuel Macron went to see him, the French president, and they were such a distance apart. I can't imagine they could actually hear each other. Yet here we have this video released, as I said, by the Kremlin of President Vladimir Putin on the ground in Ukraine. Do you believe the talk that it could have been a body double? Was it really him?
Well, again, there's a lot in that question. I mean, I think the long table is probably more a snub to Western leaders than anything to do with COVID. As soon as Xi Jinping was visiting, Putin was almost cuddling him. So I don't think it's a worry about COVID per se. I think that's more a statement of his, trying to be Russia being great again. In terms of information, yeah, it's definitely an information campaign. I'll come back onto that. In terms of Putin, what was interesting is when Putin visited Crimea, he was cheered and he was the adulation of the crowd. But none of that for when he was visiting Ukraine. I have little doubt that it was him visiting. I don't see a reason why he wouldn't. For a domestic audience, he'd want to be seen to be powerful and taking control. But he was only visiting commanders, and those commanders are normally a long way back from the front line. So I don't suppose in any sense that he was anywhere close to the front line. And I remember commenting at the time that I bet he didn't meet any of the fighters, particularly those who were involved in Bakhmut, because A, he wouldn't like what they said, and B, they'd probably try and strangle him for putting them in that position in the first place. But he and all of this stuff is always carefully stage managed for the domestic audience. So I think what he wanted to see, show, was that he was strong, the war was going well, and to a domestic audience, he desperately needs more people to sign up for the army. So by demonstrating it was a control and everything is going well, I suspect that's what he was actually doing. In terms of the information war, I think there's you could do a complete program on this, because when I was involved with the invasion of invasion of Iraq or whatever, I think we always embedded media with our military operation, which was good in some respects because they always had an informed view. It was bad because we could always control what they saw. I think what we're seeing on this conflict, though, is the world's media running freely around Ukraine, reporting whatever they like. They're trying to, yes, Ukraine is feeding them lines, but they're frankly able to report what they see. In Russia, nobody's allowed to do that. There is absolute control of any messaging media. So people like me, I have no axe to grind. In fact, the Ukrainian interpreter at Sky News was very clear to me. She said, "Please don't think the Ukrainians are good. We're the same Slav nation. We've had to survive. There's a lot of corruption in Ukraine. but the difference is we didn't invade another country. We have been invaded, and luckily we are strong enough and determined enough to fight the Russian invader. But it's not, they will not easily, Ukraine will not easily be able to join the EU, not easily be able to join NATO, because frankly, they don't meet any of the requirements at the moment. But I do think that juxtaposition of information war is that the Western media is running freely around. They can report whatever they like. You're not restricted. We can talk about anything you like. I'm not a puppet of the West. I am briefed by a whole load of different people. But frankly, we all have I've fought in wars. I know how these things work, whereas nobody in Russia is allowed to say anything. The news media is clamped completely. So you'd have to read something into that the West is largely hearing what's going on with a degree of cynicism, depending on who's saying it. But in Russia, there's only one line anybody's hearing, and that's what President Putin is saying. And none of them are hearing about the true cost of this war. None of the population are hearing about the dreadful atrocities that are being committed, about leveling. They're all talking about, we're liberating, we're denazifying. I think if anybody was to visit Bakhmut today, it doesn't look like a city that's been liberated.
Indeed. Very good to get your analysis on this. Do appreciate your time, retired Vice-Marshal Sean Bell. Thank you for joining us on the front line.
My pleasure, Anne.